everyone, and welcome. Today, we're diving into a series of ancient poems that were born from a truly devastating national crisis. What's so incredible about them is how they map out this journey from just absolute despair to a really profound hope. It's a blueprint, in a way, for getting through catastrophe, and honestly, it feels more relevant now than ever.
And it all starts with a cry like this one. Just a raw, desperate plea screamed into what feels like a totally silent, empty sky. This really sets the stage for everything that follows. An entire nation on its knees, just begging for some kind of response from a God who seems to have vanished.
So what could possibly cause that level of desperation? Well, our first section here is going to look at the historical disaster that sparked these poems in the first place, the complete and utter destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah, the scene described here it's unflinching. Psalm 79 does not hold back. We're told this was the work of the Babylonian army, and their goal wasn't just to win a war, it was total humiliation. They trashed the Holy Temple, they tore Jerusalem down to nothing but rubble, and they left the dead out in the open for birds to scavenge. It was an absolute, unthinkable catastrophe.
You can imagine, this whole thing created a massive crisis of faith for the people. How could a loving God let this happen? This slide does a brilliant job of showing the two sides of God they were trying to reconcile. See, the psalmist understood that God's love for what's right, for righteousness, meant he also had this fierce anger, this wrath, against unrighteousness and sin. For them, these two things weren't a contradiction. They were two sides of the very same holy character. The physical destruction was one thing, but the spiritual crisis it kicked off was maybe even worse. The people felt completely and utterly abandoned, which led them to start questioning a God who had just gone silent.
This question is right at the heart of Psalm 80, and it is just painful. Can you imagine praying for help, for rescue, and feeling like your prayers aren't just being ignored, but that they're actually making God angry? They truly believed their past sins were so bad that even their cries for help were being rejected.
And this comparison here just shows how deep that disconnect was. They'd always known God as their shepherd, their protector, but now they felt like a flock being torn apart by wolves. The God they believed was enthroned in glory suddenly felt like a God who was pouring out his wrath right on top of them.
And if that wasn't bad enough, it wasn't just one enemy. Psalm 83 lists this whole coalition of nations around them that had teamed up. Their goal, in the psalmist's own words, was to wipe Israel completely off the map. So they weren't just defeated, they were surrounded by enemies who wanted them totally annihilated. That feeling of abandonment must have been absolute.
So where do you even go from there? I mean, at their absolute lowest point, the psalmists make this really crucial pivot. They stop focusing on the pain they're in right now, and they turn their attention to the past, using memory like an anchor in the middle of a hurricane.
And one of the most powerful ways they do this is through this metaphor of a vine, which we see in Psalm 80. Now, this vine isn't just a plant, it's a symbol for the entire story of the people of Israel and their long, long history with God. This visual here lays that story out perfectly in three parts. First, God brought this vine out of Egypt. He rescued his people from slavery. Second, he planted them in a new land and they took root and just flourished. But now they're in stage 3. The protective walls around the vineyard are smashed down, leaving that vine completely vulnerable to destruction. And here's the key. This is so important. This act of remembering wasn't just them getting nostalgic about the good old days. No. By remembering God's power to save them in the past from Egypt, they found the words, they found the courage to ask him to save them again in the future.
This pivot to the past leads to this really dramatic shift in tone. Hope starts to creep back in. And not because their situation has changed, it hasn't. It's because their perspective has changed. They start to find joy, not because things are getting better, but in the idea of God's presence itself.
Just listen to the change here in Psalm 84. That cry of pure desperation has turned into a cry of deep, deep longing. With the temple destroyed, the psalmist isn't just sad about a building. He's yearning for the presence of God that the building represented. His soul, he says, faints with desire for that connection.
And that longing leads to one of the most powerful statements in the entire book of Psalms. The psalmist says that just one single day in God's presence is better than 1,000 days anywhere else.
Think about that. Even in exile, even surrounded by ruins, that one thing is what matters more than anything.
And to really drive the point home, he says this: he would rather be a humble doorkeeper, just standing at the entrance to God's house, than living in luxury in the tents of the wicked. Being close to God had become more valuable than any worldly power or comfort or status.
So, what is this hope actually based on? It's not just wishful thinking. It's based on a renewed understanding of God's unchanging character. In Psalm 86, David clings to these attributes. He's reminding himself and God that God isn't defined by this current disaster, but by these core traits. This is the bedrock of his trust. And this understanding leads David to ask this really powerful rhetorical question. After everything he's seen, everything he's been through, he looks at all the other so-called gods and powers in the world, and he just asks this.
And the answer is just so emphatic. There is no one else. The journey that started with questioning God's actions ends with this powerful reaffirmation of his absolute uniqueness, his sovereignty. And so that brings us to the end of this journey. And it ends with one final, kind of surprising prayer that really wraps up everything that's been learned through this whole crisis. What's so striking here is the humility. This is David, a powerful king, and he comes before God and just admits, I am poor and needy. He's acknowledging that he has zero resources, zero power on his own to fix this situation. His only hope is to rely completely on God. And this is his final request. After all the pain, all the questioning, all the rediscovery of hope, he doesn't ask for his enemies to be destroyed. He doesn't ask for his kingdom to be restored. He simply asks, show me a sign of your goodness. And that plea leaves us with a question to think about. In our own crises, what does it mean to stop looking for our circumstances to change and to start looking instead for a sign of goodness?